Welcome Internet to Psychologist's Casual Review. So it is a casual review and it's called PCR because YouTube's title does not allow me to put the name of the show in full because the title of this article is too long. So this article is titled in French, Entre agony psychique, déni psychotique et perversion narcissique. So in English, it's between psychic agony, psychotic denial, and narcissistic perversion. So it's a very, very interesting article, very short, but very, very rich and dense in ideas. So basically, Racamier is a very well-known French psychiatrist, or should I say was. He's a man that really theorized on narcissistic perversion, which would be equivalent to malignant narcissism in English. And he's the French version of someone, let's say someone like Otto Kernberg that really worked with those people. He's basically the equivalent. And he, in this short but very interesting article, basically points out that denial is on a spectrum. It's not something that's unified. Often there are different types, and that there's a whole continuum, both from psychotic episodes and people who have psychosis, to people who have perversion and people who have malignant narcissism. That all of that exists within a whole range and a whole spectrum. So basically what he says is that for there to be denial, there needs to be a massive psychic investment. That idea that denial is easy is a false one. Denial is incredibly complicated for the mind to withhold with any duration or length, because it asks for the process to be so massive, so impeccable, that puts a weight on the psyche which is just unbearable. What he says is that basically, because it's unbearable, it's untenable. However, he also states that it is untenable in of itself, but when people start creating alternatives, or denying and avoiding, or denying and becoming delusional, or denying and creating a neo-reality, or somewhat of a twisted reality, the denial becomes much more tenable as a defense, as a mechanism. And he says that basically there are multiple types of denials. For example, psychotic denial, which is, a counter investment. It's not the right word, but the idea is that it's the psychotic person is breaking down. The whole breakdown of reality shows that there was a denial that was there from the start, at least according to Racamier. I'm not sure I agree with that, but he says that there was on the surface a form of denial of the psychotic processes, and there's a breakdown, and in that breakdown there's so much suffering that they start denying death itself through delusions of grandiosity, or of being all-powerful, immortal, and so on and so forth, and that there is a denial of reality itself, of not necessarily the fact that there is an object, or even the power of the object. Here the object is the other person, or another relationship, or something different from the self. It's object and self, right? It's the philosophical distinction. So basically the object is not denied, meaning that it's not the outside world that's denied, or necessarily that there is an outside world. However, what is denied in of itself is the origins of the object, meaning that what is happening to the person is that basically the delusions are going to be constitutive of, I wasn't created equal, I was not created the same as others, I'm special, and it's going to become delusional. It's not the special, like, for example, you discover that you're working differently. It's really a whole other world of special, meaning that, for example, you're the hidden son of a very famous person, or you're the true reincarnation of, I don't know, let's say Jesus or something like that, which your origin is completely broken down and reinvented, because what is happening at the moment of psychosis is so massive that only a denial of the real world and a re-anchoring in new origins can save the person from complete psychic death. And that's what it is. And here I went a little further on Racamier because he doesn't necessarily go on into too much detail, except to say that there is a fantasy of self procreation. Basically, you created yourself, auto-engendrement in French. And I don't really know how you say it in English, but basically the idea is that you are the one that created yourself. You're self-fulfilling and you're self-creating. And basically, he's going to say that this is an ultimate avoidance of death, meaning that basically, if you're self-creating, you don't die, you just recreate yourself. And this is a complete denial of death and the impact of death in our lives, which I think is very true, that even though it's, for most of us, a fantasy, it can become reality-ish in the psychotic processes that happen for people, that they become convinced that they're immortal, that they have created themselves. And that fantasy is always going to be a risk, at least for people who are vulnerable to that type of manifestations. And he goes on to say that basically that fantasy of self-creation, self-auto-creation is basically a way to answer an absolute disaster. He calls that disaster a psychic white event. And that psychic white event is something very interesting because I pictured it when he described it as like an explosion, like an atomic explosion. The brightness of the explosion just like hits you in the face, and there's no way of like dealing with it. It just completely overloads everything. And basically that's how I pictured it when he wrote it. And the idea is basically it's becoming both terrifying because everything is just deconstructed and fascinating because of the effects that are so sensory and so primitive that it's ultimate. And in a way that event cannot be put into meaning, and it creates a new meaning, which is what we find in psychosis. But he says that there is also a continuum, that even though it's not as extreme in perversion, perverts also have a denial of the object, but it's not going to be exactly the same way that the psychotics do, because for psychotics the object is going to become an object of recreated origins, an object that's going to become a little different, a delusional object. For the pervert, meaning the sexual pervert, the object is going to become a fetishistic object. It's going to be extracted from its meaning, its original meaning, given autonomy, and that autonomy is going to become massive, and it's going to basically replace the meaning it once had. Meaning that, for example, prototypically, right, if ever a fetishist has a fetish on, let's say, boots, I mean, the most classic textbook example, right? At least in psychoanalysis. Well, basically, what he's denying is the castration of the woman, meaning the woman does not have a penis, and he's going to put the boots instead of the penis of the woman. Unconsciously, of course. I mean, everyone knows that basically assigned female at birth and women have vaginas, right? No one is denying that. But on an unconscious level, there is a complete denial of that. And that's going to become a fetishistic object. And in a way, it's better for it to be devoided of any meaning than becoming a non-object, as Racamier would say. Basically, a non-existent object, or a destroyed, broken, annihilated object. Well, French is always a little classy. Anyway, the interesting point is that basically the pervert cannot sacrifice the object. He has to maintain it, but he has to transform it, twist it, in order to fulfill the fact of having had trauma, and that trauma is going to be a twistedness. And he also talks about the malignant narcissist. And this is where it's going to become much more twisted, because basically the malignant narcissist is going to conserve an object relationship, but that object is going to be the depository, virtually the trash can of his own depression, his own grief, and his own sorrow. The malignant narcissist is not going to accept that within him. He's going to throw it onto others. The others are going to then painfully try and transform it, and that painful transformation is going to be what's going to give him great joy, pleasure, and ecstasy even. And basically what Racamier says is that for psychotics, what is over-invested is the words, even at a point where words are just going to have a meaning of their own. But for malignant narcissists, what's going to be overly invested are words instead of beings, meaning that the being of others is going to be completely stampeded because they don't care. And basically, they only believe in their own sense of self and their own words and their own perspectives. And that's basically also linked to a primitive agony, to use the words of the title. That denial is not, if it's massive, it's that the whole life of the person is basically centered around denial. It's not just denial's the mechanism, because that doesn't last. Anyway, I hope you found the review interesting. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments. I'm not an expert on Racamier, so keep that in mind if you ever ask, but I found that the article was fairly interesting. That's why I read it, and that's why I wanted to share it with you. So please feel free to comment, and I'll see you in the next one.